Well, tēnā koutou katoa. No America ho no te timatanga, ko te taita toku maunga, ko waitaki toku awa, ko otatahi toku kainga inai nei, e roia toku tunga mahi o Perryfield Lawyers, ko Steven Moe toku ingoa, no reira ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. Hey, everybody, it's great to welcome you here to a session with Shamubeel Eaqub. I think we're all looking forward to the insights that he's going to share with us. I know I always love to talk with Shamubeel because I come away thinking about things in just a different perspective. So we're going to get into that. And the way this session is going to work is he's got a little presentation where he's going to be outlining some of the state of where we're at. I think we can all agree it's an unusual time in the world, various things going on. And then we would love to have your questions. So before we hit record, I was asking, where are you in the country? What's the weather like? So we know you know how to use the chat function. So please, in the chat, put questions. We would love to get to those. We'll get to as many as we can. And just to open it up, I'd like to start with a little karakia. So, whakataka te hao ki te uru, whakataka te hao ki te tonga, kia makina kina ki uta, kia matatara ki tai, e hi ake ane te atakura he tio, he huke, he ahunga, he homie, huie, taikie. And that one,
Thank
I love that one because it was actually episode 100 of Seeds podcast, which is another thing that I do. The translation is, it will be icy cold inland and icy cold on the shore. May the dawn rise red tipped on ice, on snow, on frost. Join, gather, and intertwine. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Shamubeel, I'm going to hand over to you. Remember, while we're listening to Shamubeel, type questions you've got in the chat, and we'll get to that. And then once Shamubeel has done a presentation, we're going to have a bit of back and forth and dialogue. So over to you.
Amazing. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for hosting today. This is a little bit of an experiment for all of us. We thought we'd see who's interested in just getting a bit of a check on what's happening in the economy. And part of the reason is I'm getting a lot of requests for presentations right now, and people are really interested in understanding what's going on in the economy right now. Partly because I think things feel a little bit dark, and partly because I think some of the usual patterns of things are not quite normal. So I'll take you through some of that and some of my views. The big themes for today are very much around what's happening with the wider economy, and very much the case that we're in recession right now. A big part of that is the hangover from COVID, but also because of very high interest rates and fiscal austerity that we have embarked upon. For the outlook for the next 12 months, things are still looking a little bit dark, at least for the next 6 months, because we know that monetary policy works with a lag. Those higher interest rates, people are still refinancing onto higher mortgage rates. We still have this the slowdown in government spending to come through, and all these lags in decisions that are being made elsewhere. But the implications for us, I think, are not to get too hung up on the negativity, because I think it does feel like everything is turning dark all at the same time. When I look at previous cycles, I think, I don't know if you guys have heard of this joke. Economists have predicted 7 of the last 2 recessions. We're very good at predicting recessions over and over again, much more often than they happen in reality. So for me, it's much more about cycles always do turn. Once you're in a recession, we know there's probably another 6 to 9 months before things turn around, but it is going to get worse before it gets better. And the message that I've been trying to get across to my audiences over the course of the last 6 months is hang tight. This is a really tough period. A lot of people are going to experience difficult times, not everyone and not equally. So look out for each other. Sometimes it might be about looking out for yourself. It might be looking after your family, could be your colleagues, local businesses, and whatnot. So there will be a period in the beginning of next year when I'm pretty confident things will start to look better. But there is this period of the next 6 months we still have to traverse. And this is kind of the picture of the economy that I like to present. A lot of the way that I describe the economy is that we want the economy to be better off for more people. And we measure that by looking at GDP per capita just as a shorthand, not because it's perfect, but it's a shorthand. And you can see on the picture on the left-hand side, the GFC in 2008, 2009, the pink area, when GDP per capita fell. And then you can see the course of the last year or so where GDP per capita has also been falling quite sharply. Now, we've had lots of population growth through this period that has kind of held up a lot of the headline rates, but the underlying picture has been very much that things are getting tougher. If you look on the right-hand side, this is a slightly different way of thinking about the economy. So the way that we measure the economy is returns to labor and returns to capital. And so that's profits and earnings from work. And again, not perfect, but that's how we measure it. And you can see in the green line that returns to capital, that returns of profits of businesses has taken a really big hit over the course of the last year or so. And this is a very unusual recession compared to previous ones. We haven't seen such a big business recession before. Typically, we tend to see some impact and quite a lot of pain in the household sector. This time around, this has been very much a business recession, which has been much, much larger rather than the household jobs recession that we normally see. And it kind of bears out in the data. So, when we look at the economic data, the things that we're trying to look for is not just what is happening, but how are people feeling? Because confidence and optimism are quite important drivers. The way I think about it is, if you're optimistic, you're more likely to be doing things, as long as all the other conditions hold. But if you look at the picture on the left-hand side, what we can see is that in the green line, you can see businesses are saying, the economy is feeling quite tough right now. Our sales are falling. And on the gray line, they're saying, but I'm hopeful that in the next 12 months, things will get better. And we see that quite often where there's this divergence between what's happening right now versus what the expectations are. And a lot of that is, surely it can't get any worse. Unfortunately, so far this year, it has been getting worse, and things have been feeling harder and harder. On the right-hand side is a picture of how households are feeling, how we are feeling as consumers. And you can see in the green line, the impact on our current finances, if our money is going far enough. And the answer is it's not. And that's because incomes are not keeping up with the cost of living. Many of us are experiencing increases in mortgage rates as we refinance our fixed mortgages. All of that is weighing down on people. And on the gray line, you can see the similar kind of dynamic where people are saying, in the next 12 months, we're really hopeful that things will look better. So there's always hope, but the reality is that in the middle of a recession, things feels quite tough. Now, there are some reasons for cautious optimism. And part of that is, so far, we haven't seen significant job losses, and we haven't seen significant business failures as yet. It's coming, but I'm very hopeful that we're not going to see the same kind of widespread job losses and business failures as we had seen previously. And partly, well, maybe more for jobs than businesses, partly because if you look at the left-hand side, when the GFC happened, we saw the job losses, and nearly 10 years before jobs went back to where they were pre-pandemic, pre the recession. This time around, we've been through the course of the last pandemic and the period after very, very strongly. And businesses are telling us that it's still really important for them to hold on to their staff because they've finally gotten to a full complement. They've spent a huge amount of effort in recruiting, training up people, getting them embedded into their cultures. So they're very loath to let people go. And on the right-hand side, you can see the number of businesses in New Zealand. And you can see that during recession, it's not so much that there are huge amounts of business failures, but it's more that we don't see many new businesses starting. So we do see some business failures. And I was speaking at the Insolvency and Restructuring Conference a few months ago. And there was a fairly upbeat room, right? Because they're experiencing a lot of activity right now. Unfortunately, for the rest of us, that's not a very good thing. So we are going to see some of the activity picking up because of the decline in profits, because things are feeling a bit tougher. Now, the reason why households are feeling quite tough is because this recession feels really old. And it feels old for a couple of reasons. One of them is really not, unlike previous recession, which is about job losses, this time it's very much about incomes are just not keeping up. And you can see that on the left-hand side. That's the picture of wages, average wages in New Zealand per hour, adjusted for the cost of living. The first year of the pandemic, you can see that real incomes fell because we were just grateful to have a job, so we didn't ask for a pay rise. And when we got pay rises in the years that followed, they just couldn't keep up with the very high inflation that we were experiencing. And so as of today, real wages are pretty much where they were in 2019. So we're still looking at very difficult conditions for households because our expectations are things will generally get better, But in fact, that has not been the case over the course of the last 3 years. And on the right-hand side, you can see the consequence of that. You can see that real spending on retail sales was trending up, and then it peaked in the middle of 2011 and 2021, and has been trending down since then. And it's now at the lowest level since 2017. And if you adjust for population, we're at a much lower level. So those are the reasons for weakness. It's not so much that we've had widespread job losses. It's not because of those kinds of things, but it's just because people's incomes are just not stretching far enough. And I used this chart at a presentation for some of my retail clients, and I think this was quite useful for people because it gives you a sense of how those cycles play out. And the kind of recession or cycle that we're experiencing at the moment is quite different. So I don't think we should be thinking back to the 70s and 80s, which were a really tough period for New Zealand. I don't think the Asian financial crisis is a good template. The GFC kind of similar, but if you look at the current recession that we're experiencing, we are kind of 3 years into the recession, but the steepness of the fall is deeper than we have experienced before. And so, there's probably another 6 months where things are going to get tougher before things start to recover. But it's very important that we keep this in the context of this is not a typical recession, but also we have some lessons of previous recessions that we should keep in mind. The other thing that I would like you to think about is just because there is a recession doesn't mean it's being felt equally across all the different parts of the economy. So what's happening in retail is not necessarily what's happening in construction or what's happening in manufacturing. So on the left-hand side, you can see a picture of construction, which had been doing really, really well until about a couple of years ago. And then you can see the picture of manufacturing on the right-hand side, which quite frankly is looking pretty dark. And we're losing a lot of those parts of the manufacturing industry that have been just hanging on. And every time we have a recession, we tend to lose that manufacturing capacity. Unfortunately, this impact tends to be felt much more keenly in the provinces compared to the urban areas. So when I look at manufacturing in Auckland or Christchurch, those are actually holding together really well because they're quite specialized. But some of the other manufacturing that's in the provinces, not always, but at the margin, that's where we're seeing a lot of this pain. That big steep fall that we're seeing, that manufacturing activity per capita is now at the lowest level since the 1960s. So, we are talking about a really big retrenchment in different parts of the economy. Now, this is a chart I showed to some of my supermarket clients, and they were really quite shocked. And I was really shocked when I saw this data. Let me explain what you're seeing here. This is measuring what share of households bought a particular product in any given week. And so this was just a reference week, right? So on the left-hand side, very left-hand bar is the share of households that bought vegetables or fruit and vegetables in the first week, in that week. So going back to the 1980s, it used to be about 90% of households. In 2023, it was only 60% of households that bought fruit. It was only 66% of households that bought vegetables. The impact of the recession is not being felt equally. The cost of living crisis has impacted certain parts of the society much, much harder. People cannot afford necessities. This is really shocking stuff. This is poverty that's increasing in New Zealand at a rate that I have never seen in the data before. So this is really quite significant. And this sometimes gets kind of lost in the narrative because when we're talking about the economy, we're talking about the aggregate and the averages, and sometimes this distribution is lost. So keep this in the back of your mind when we're talking about this economy, because sometimes it can feel very impersonal, but actually the personal effects are very, very, very different for different parts of society. But also, I think sometimes we look at data depending on where you are. Sometimes you might be reading media from the US, from Australia, and sometimes it's easy to kind of get caught up in what's happening in those countries. But the reality is that our economic cycle and our economic issues are not the same. So on the picture on the left-hand side, that's New Zealand, the black line, that's real retail sales per capita. And you can see how deep that recession has been for us compared to the US, which is the green line at the top, the EU, which is the second line, and Australia, which is the gray line. So we are facing a recession that's quite different, much steeper. And I'm really worried that our policy responses are not responding fast enough, given the depth and the, I think, out of sync nature of the recession that we're experiencing. Now, having said that, you can see on the right-hand side that our exports are currently shrinking. And the reason for that is those countries on the left-hand side, China, whether it's China, Australia, the USA, Europe, those economies are slowing. And particularly China has had a really big slowdown over the course of the last couple of years. And you can see that impact in our exports falling in the last 12 months. And you can see China is quite a big contributor to that. The US, in comparison, has been holding up really well. That's been one of the big success stories of the last 3 years during COVID. America started to buy lots of our products, including things like New Zealand wine. If you look at our New Zealand wine exports, they just went through the roof and it looked amazing. You could just see this explosion. Now, funnily enough, it turns out Americans tend to drink more New Zealand wine at home rather than when they're out at restaurants. So, different preferences. And what we're seeing in the data and the impact that we're going to see across New Zealand is this slowdown in the New Zealand economy and the slowdown that we have seen in the global economy has two twin impacts in New Zealand. On the left-hand side, you can see our import volumes are down. We're importing less products, whether it's in capital goods or whether it's in consumer goods. And on the right-hand side, you can see our exports, which have been kind of holding up okay, but have really taken a bit of a big knock in the last 3 months or so. So, we've got this different impacts and different moving parts across the economy that are all moving at the same time and are having quite a synchronized negative effect over the course of the next 6 months. The tools for dealing with this economic condition or economic conditions are kind of threefold. These are the kind of three big pillars of levers that we can pull. One is monetary policy, one is fiscal policy, and the final one is social and economic policy. And they all matter, but they matter in different ways. When it comes to monetary policy, that's really the Reserve Bank is using interest rates to kind of deal with inflation and manage the economic cycle. And you can see on the left-hand side, inflation is moderating. So around the world, we experienced this big increase in inflation through 21, 22, and started to moderate kind of in 23 and has been moderating a lot in 24. I'm pretty optimistic that we'll see that fall further. And the reason for that is we kind of went through this kind of triple shocks over the last few years. First, we had essentially this kind of the closure of the global economy right through COVID. And then we had, in New Zealand, at least we had closed borders and we had real shortages of people. And then we had all the stimulus of low interest rates, lots of government spending, and lots of demand. So you had this kind of three consecutive shocks that created lots of price increases. But those have all unwound, and I'm pretty confident that we will see inflation coming off in the next 12 months. And you can see on the right-hand side, all those countries are also starting to toy with interest rates coming off just in the next little while. The risk for us is, will the central bank in New Zealand, the RBNZ, will they go fast enough and far enough to help the economy? Because the reality is that our central bank tends to be much more fearful of inflation rather than predicting economic growth. So their focus is very much on inflation. They're what you might call almost religious in their pursuit of inflation compared to other central bankers who are much more balanced in the way they think about the economy. And as a result, I think there is a real risk of policy error from the central bank where they will cut too late and too slow, and that will create unnecessary damage in terms of future job losses and future business closures. And the reason I say that is interest rates take a long time to come through. So this year, we've got over $200 billion of mortgages that will be refinancing in the next 12 months. That's an extraordinary amount of mortgages that will be refinancing in a very short period of time. So people who borrowed 3 years ago, they'll be experiencing nearly a 4% increase in interest rates. People who borrowed 2 years ago will be experiencing a one and a bit percent increase in interest rates. So there's still a lot of pain to work through the system. So we just need to be really mindful that just because the Reserve Bank hasn't been raising interest rates for a while doesn't mean the impact is all done. And also, it doesn't mean that once the Reserve Bank starts cutting rates, that we're going to see relief in the economy straight away. It takes a good 12 months before that flows through. So really, the big kind of catalyst for economic growth is coming through in late 2025, assuming the Reserve Bank cuts interest rates in the early part. Now, very quickly on fiscal policy, because I think this really matters, and this is a big part of the current risks profile for New Zealand, is fiscal policy right now is very much an austerity path. And that was the promise from the general election, lead up to the general election, that we will give you tax cuts that will be paid for by less spending and less borrowing. They have given tax cuts. They will spend a little bit less, but they'll be borrowing more. So, 2 out of 3, not too bad. But the reality is that the net result of this, if you look at all the spending that the government does and all the taxes that it takes, the net effect of that is that the government will be taking money out of the economy over the course of the next 12 months. And so there is a lot of austerity still to come through over the course of the next 12 months to 24 months, which you can see in the pink bars on the right-hand side. So we have interest rates, high interest rates still working through. We have low confidence, low business confidence, low consumer confidence, and we've got government all working against the economy. And that's why we can be pretty confident that it's going to be pretty painful. Now, when it comes to the government, it's quite funny, right? When the budget comes out, there is all this hoo-ha about the big numbers. And this is a really detailed picture, so you don't need to look at it right here. There's a link in the chat. Have a look at that. Maybe Stephen or Kareem, you could drop another link in. But it's a good way to kind of just have a look at where the government's budget spends are going for the next 12 months. And the reason I say that is when the budget comes out, there is so much data, so much information. No one knows what is actually being increased and what is being decreased. So it's really hard to get a handle on when the government says we're pursuing austerity and we're going to do this, but we're going to deliver this and but not that. How do you know? And the best way to look at it is to go, where are they actually spending their money on? So I kind of took a couple of case studies just for us to have a look at. One of them is housing. So if you kind of click on the housing bit of that visualization, what you'll see that the government is actually going to be spending a lot more money on housing in the next 12 months. So there is more money. But if you look within it, and if you have a play with it, you will see that there is less money going to Kaingora, and there is more money going to other bits of housing programs. And so it's not so much that we need to be overly political in thinking about how to interpret the budget, but it's about understanding where is the money being prioritized and where is the money not being prioritized. Because I'll tell you what, even for somebody like me who's an expert in this stuff, it's a huge amount of information that's really hard to consume quickly. So having a tool like this is quite cool. So I put it up on my LinkedIn after the budget came out when I saw it. And lots of people went and had a play and they're like, oh, I didn't know this. I didn't know that we spend money on this. Or I didn't know that they're cutting spending on this. Or I didn't know they were increasing spending on this. So it's quite helpful to get a sense of what is the money actually being spent on? And is there a real translation between what they say versus what they do in allocating their funds? This morning, health was in the headlines about how there is a massive deficit in health. Well, no shit, right? If you look at the picture on the left-hand side, the budget for health is the same as it was last year. And the demand for health goes up massively every year because population grows and the cost of delivering services grows. So, of course, there's going to be a deficit. You plan for it. You design that deficit. So it's not surprising that's there. And if you play with the data, again, you'll be able to get a sense of where the appropriations for the next 12 months have gone up and where they have gone down to get a sense of what impact there will be. The reality is that when you think about fiscal policy, it has quite a lot of impact on the economy because the government is not the only big player in the economy, but it's quite significant in certain parts of the economy. So if you're involved in community housing, for example, that's your only buyer. If you're in health, public health providers are the biggest part of it. Private health is really small in New Zealand. So have a play with this information because your areas of interest, you'll be able to understand where those things are happening. But when I looked into the detail, what was really clear is, of course, every government is trying to find the right balance that's consistent with their ideology. And what they're trying to say is, we want to do all these different things, and can we make it all fit? And the answer is, no, you can't, because you always have to make trade-offs and choices. Now, very quickly, I want to give you some wonky stuff, because I think this stuff is important. And it's important because I think this is how I describe government to my clients, right? And especially my government clients. So there's a few different things in government. There's partly it's around legislation and constitution. As you know, in New Zealand, that's quite messy. But we have kind of legislated and permissive boundaries, and then we have certain instruments and powers that are given to government departments, government agencies to do their work. Then there is the politics, which is about what citizens want. By and large, that's what democracy is trying to achieve. And it's about what activities we do and services and how it's delivered. So if you think about it, it's about, if we're going to do rubbish collection, do we do the rubbish collection? And if we do, at what quality do we do that? Both of those decisions really matter. And The current attack at the moment in the political boundaries is very much around the attack on the public service, around the organization. And what we really want is a public service that's evidence-based, advisor, and a very efficient doer. And a lot of the attack right now is based on the second one, which is that the political belief is that they're not efficient doers. And I think we could all find examples of where the public service hasn't been very efficient in some delivery aspects. But also we know that this attack has been going on for some time. So if you think about the Michael Cullen government, the Helen Clark government, it was very significantly against the public service as an advisor. Do you remember the comment about the Treasury's ideological burps? And it was very much that, oh, we don't believe those nerds who are sitting in the chairs. These are not the right people to kind of lead us. So this is not a political and ideological position. It is actually a wider political malaise in New Zealand where we are attacking the systems of government, of our public service and our institutions. And I worry a lot that that is going to weaken things for New Zealand. Now, a really busy picture, but I love using this picture again with my government clients because sometimes when we think about government, we think about things on those right three corners. The resourcing that government does, the delivery it does, and the control around policies and rules and regulations. But actually, governments also do all those things on the left-hand side. Lots of influencing, lots of engagement, lots of designing. So there's a lot of coordination, cohesion, information, the sunlight aspects. There's so much that government does. The businesses of government is enormously complicated. It is enormously wide. It's enormously deep. So I think it's a real problem when we try and make this a much less nuanced story about what government does and how it does things. So why did I tell you about all of those kinds of things? Because right now we're facing a recession. We've got high interest rates and we've got fiscal austerity. We know that the outlook is not going to be easy for the next 6 months. But once interest rates start to be reduced, we should get to a place where we will see some economic recovery coming through. I'm still quite worried about the austerity. I'm still quite worried about public policy, which is not thinking about, I guess, the distributional impacts of some of the things that are happening. When I think about the outlook for the next 12 months, particularly for 2025, I'm cautiously optimistic that cycles always turn. As economists, it's very easy for us to be pessimistic about always seeing the downside, but we know that once you're in a recession, it always recovers. It will get worse before it gets better, but if there's one thing I can urge you all to think about is not just hang tight, because that's important, but it's the last bit, which is about looking out for each other. We're going to need it because the reality is it's not going to affect all of us equally. And if we look after each other, it will make it much easier for us to navigate these difficult times. So I might stop there.
Thank you so much. That was great. And I love all those different charts and things. And a particular shout out to Kareem from Orbviz, who's on the call here, in terms of the visual way that that tool that you showed us works. In the chat is a link to it if people want to explore that. And I know that he would welcome having conversations with people as well. Shamubeel, the chat's gone lots of different comments, as I knew it would. There seem to be a few different themes. Some questions or comments are very specific, like around that chart you showed about the groceries and what are people buying and how that's changing and what does that show. But I think could we start with a macro issue? And I'm really interested in the term that unfortunately got used a couple times in the slides there, austerity. Like, what does austerity mean? The definition, according to Google, is the condition of living without unnecessary things and without comfort, with limited money or goods. So it's just an interesting phrase that we see used more and more. Interesting to think about it. But before we started on LinkedIn this morning, I put a question out, and this ties in with this macro question. So Tasneem Gold said, is the economic ecosystem today completely different to anything that we've ever seen before? And she gave examples: globally interconnected, debt, inequality, or what are the historic parallels that we could watch for, or we could learn from, or avoid? Is there anything, thinking of the past and where we are today?
What a great question. And the way that I describe it is history rhymes, but it doesn't repeat. So there are absolutely lessons to be learned from history. And In fact, some of my favorite economic reading is economic history. So if anybody's interested, the work by David Auteur is excellent, and Darren Acemoglu, they write beautifully about economic history through centuries. And for New Zealand, I think there are some really important lessons. So, for example, our income inequality today is similar to what it was before the reforms of the 1940s and 50s reforms of the building of the welfare state. In terms of the global connectedness, we've never been this connected as we are today. So yes, things are different, but things are also similar. The human condition doesn't change. So the way that I describe it for my clients is, if you're thinking about the issues that are likely to really present themselves, are thematically the same. It is about demographics. It is about social kind of cohesion. It is about income inequality. It is about new thing, climate change. It is going to be about technological change. It is those things that have always been kind of the big kind of thematic drivers, but how they impact on us are going to be different. So just for example, on demography, we know that we're going to be a much older nation. And as a result, the demographic impacts are going to be very different, because we're likely to be setting ourselves up for some kind of big political fight in the not too distant future between all the promises that people have made to themselves in their old age, but never paid for. And we're going to ask young people of the future, go, can you just honor the promise that I made myself? It turns out the lack of long-termism in the way that we design things is problematic. So I think it's probably quite a big question to answer quickly on this, but the way that I describe it is absolutely, history is a beautiful lens for us to think about some of those issues, whether it's around geopolitics, whether it's around social cohesion, whether it's an income inequality. All of these issues have always been around. But for me, it's really important that we take the lessons of how we respond. And inevitably, the common themes are around solidarity, about working together and being evidence-based.
That's really helpful. It's interesting to me thinking of my own family history. You can tell from my accent, I'm from America originally. So my great-grandparents lived through the Great Depression, 1930s, the stimulus packages that they had, the public works that were done. So it's interesting to think almost 100 years ago that was going on as well. By the way, people are saying in the chat, please let us know the names of the authors. So what we will do, I think, is have a follow-up email where we send a link to the recording. And if you don't mind jotting down some names, sounds like there's some people who'd love to read that. I'm just curious what you're saying about the population, because I've been reflecting on this. I lived in Japan for 5 years, and the population of Japan when I lived there 20 years ago was more than it is today. And that's an example, I think, of a country where it's actually declining. Can you talk about that? Again, this is really macro level, but to what extent have we seen populations which are increasing? Is that happening because of immigration? Is it sustainable? Any reflections on this theme of the population and demographic change?
Yeah, really good question, and one that I've been delving into in quite a lot of detail recently with one of my colleagues, Rosie, mainly because I'm interested in the politics of immigration, because it is an inherently political decision, right? There is no specific reason why we have immigration other than we choose to. And what we have observed is in New Zealand, there is no stated reason of why we want people. We don't actually ever define it. We say that we do, but we don't really get into it. And when you look at the population growth of New Zealand over the course of the last few decades, the reality is that right now, over the course of the last 10 years, the population growth that we have seen is almost entirely due to immigration. So you can see that on this picture that I'm just going to show you. Can you see those green bars?
Yeah.
That's the population growth by decade that comes from net migration. And the gray bar is what comes from natural population growth, which is babies less, people dying. And you can see through most of New Zealand's history, immigration has been an important driver of the cycle, but the majority of the population growth was us having babies. That's natural population growth was the main driver. No longer the case. And I expect that as a result of that, we will see politics really getting into immigration, because we are addicted to immigration as a way to kind of deal with our labor shortages, our economic growth, all of those kinds of things. At the same time, we don't want more people to come and share our houses and roads and infrastructure and social services. So It's a slightly complicated answer again, because I think the population growth that we've experienced is not guaranteed. So our population is going to get quite different over the course of the coming decades. We're going to be running out of young people with or without immigration, and our population is going to look really different. I just want to show you one more picture because I think this will kind of give you a sense. You can see on the left-hand side the age composition of New Zealand, that our share of young people is going to just step down quite a lot. Can you see that? And
Yep.
on the right-hand side, you can see the growth of our Maori, Asian, and Pacifica parts of our population in terms of ethnicity. So New Zealand's face is going to look extremely different over the course of the coming decades. And so this demographics matters a great deal because it changes the way we might think about what New Zealand is, right? And it's not clear to me that we're going to see the same kind of political settings and policy settings to deal with it. So New Zealand needs to have a really brave and open conversation about why do we have immigration, how much, and how do we look after it. And New Zealand is unable to do that without descending into racism. It's a really difficult conversation, a very difficult thing. But inevitably, we use it for the shorthands of economic growth and dealing with labor shortages.
It's really interesting to see the intersection between the population and politics. Because if you look over, Europe, America, most places, there's this rise of immigration being a major issue when it comes to which party is being elected, and the far right, preserving the national identity and things like that, versus the reality is that there's immigrants coming in. So yeah, really interesting. We're going to go, there's plenty of comments in the chat. So we're going to go a slightly different angle here. Kirsty had put this again, had asked me this. She's super curious to hear what you are observing in exports and manufacturing sectors, and also in thinking about processes for efficiency and waste reduction, and pivoting away from short-term thinking towards long-term processes that benefit a triple bottom line. I joked on LinkedIn, like, long-term processes, long-term, is that possible? Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, look, very quickly on manufacturing, I showed you that picture of aggregate manufacturing, which is in quite steep decline. And what we're seeing in that is this almost barbell nature, where a lot of traditional manufacturing is closing really quickly. But there is actually in New Zealand a really strong base of really niche and very excellent manufacturers. And I think they're in pretty good shape. So, Stephen, you're from Christchurch. Christchurch is kind of like the heart of precision manufacturing. We've got some amazing manufacturers there who are global in nature, but they fly below the radar. They're not ones who will become the next Tesla or next whatever. They will remain relatively small, but they're specialized, niche, and they'll continue to succeed. In terms of the waste and the efficiency gains that you asked about, that's a hard one. I think our progress when it comes to waste and waste minimization has been slow. We are getting much better, but we need to do a lot more. And part of that is really around we don't have very strong policy incentives right now for that to happen. So I think it's absolutely possible. The international evidence shows that if you had the right settings, it's totally possible to do that. And I think New Zealand can do it. The last question was around long-termism. Can we think long-term? And the answer is, of course, we can think long-term. We just don't do it very often. And I do worry about that a lot, because the reality is that when you're thinking about the future, when you're thinking about how is it that we're going to be able to do things, that's hard, right? Because we want to, it feels like we want to do things, but we don't want to make any sacrifices. Nothing's going to change. Nothing that we do today can change, but all the outcomes will change. And I'll show you just one picture that I quite like. This is a picture of, I guess, economic vision. I was doing this piece of work for Tuhoi and MB, and it was really about going, what does economic development and economic growth look like for, I guess, us as average New Zealanders versus Tuhoi on the right-hand side. So the orthodox view is on the left-hand side and Tuhoi worldview is on the right-hand side. And neither of them are wrong. But what's important to understand is what we are driving towards are entirely different pictures. So when we are thinking about success, we might be speaking past each other. And quite often the difficulty in us being able to get to a consensus of what we want to achieve and that long-term, the basis, the foundation for the long-term future of New Zealand, it becomes really difficult because I don't think we're aligned on where we want to get to. I don't think we're aligned in terms of what inputs we want. I don't think we're aligned in terms of what constraints we're willing to put into it. And I certainly don't think we're aligned in terms of the sacrifices or investments that are required to get there. And what I mean by that is we want to pay less tax, we want to have less debt, but we want to have better government services, better infrastructure, and better everything. Well, that's not a strategy, right? And it doesn't work. So these are all shoulds, but all those shoulds can't be realized if you don't come together and have a way of one driving to a common end and having a really good understanding of the investments that are required and what benefits there are and where those costs and benefits lie. Because the reality is the costs and benefits have to lie in different places across different generations, across different parts of society, because that's what long-termism is about. So I gave a talk at this global citizenship conference, I think last year, and that was very much the theme of it. And I really enjoyed kind of researching and thinking about it because it's not often you get to talk about long-termism because the reality is it's very much out of fashion. We want things done now.
But I like that perspective. And I also want to highlight that what you're talking about is that each of us has worldviews and we bring our preconceptions about what success is to the table, whether we know it or not. You know, we're fish in the goldfish bowl. We grew up a certain way. And so I like the idea as well, just to emphasize that there would be a different conception of what success looks like that maybe we could define here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that could then somehow, hopefully, cross-infect out to other parts of the world. And actually, it could be a movement where we're saying success doesn't necessarily mean more production, for example, you know, at the expense of the environment. Just picking up on that theme, one of the things that I notice in graphs of the economy is that typically the chart is looking like this, like it's a perpetual upward, like somehow we're always going to have more resources to be drawing from. Have we got that around the wrong way, or do we need to think a little bit differently? I'm going to throw in the word degrowth, which is kind of a word that I've heard some people talk about. Like at some point, do we have to say it's not about increasing production and increasing GDP and just somehow limitlessly going up if we're doing it at the expense of the planet so that our grandchildren won't have a place to live? Can you just riff off of that maybe and see where we go?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to show you some pictures because I have all this prepared. I give so many presentations. I talk about these issues to so many different people. So don't be too confused by GDP because it's just one measure, and growth is not just growth. So when we think about GDP and economic growth, you know, what we're talking about are sometimes mixed up. So sometimes we talk about economic growth in terms of resource use. Sometimes we talk about incomes. Sometimes we talk about outputs or production. These are all those kinds of things, but they're not the same things. And when I think about it from the perspective of the environment, the reality is that if you look at this picture on the left-hand side, economic growth is not always about inputs or about emissions or about resources. You can have productivity growth, you can have efficiency gains, and it can be those kinds of things. But also on the right-hand side, you can see that you can have economic growth, but you can see almost no improvement in income inequality. So there is no impact in terms of distribution. So it's a little bit of just a plea to think about economic growth in a slightly more sophisticated way rather than simply about resource use or simply about growth for the sake of growth. You know, that's why I say when we talk about economic growth, it's really about making more people better off. And better off kind of does a lot of heavy lifting here, which is about, you know, also thinking about those constraints, right? All those externalities like environmental constraints, like mental health, like distribution of incomes and wealth. All these things matter, social cohesion. These are really critical things. So I don't think degrowth as an idea has legs because it confuses inputs with outputs. But I think there is something in between of where we are today versus where we need to be, which needs to pay much closer attention to those externalities, those costs, those bad things that we do to each other and to the environment, right? And I think a lot of the ways, as an economist, of course, I would say this, but the reason why we do this is because we don't price pollution. If you had to pay for it, I bet you there'll be no business doing any pollution, right? If it hit you in the bottom, in the back pocket, you wouldn't do it. If there was a real way that we could deal with inequality that had benefits to you that you could observe, you would do it because that's playing off your selfish nature. But unfortunately, a lot of the things that we want to do in terms of the economy is about that enabling people to have choices. But we have to also have these other parts, which is about caring. That caring part of the economy will never be part of the business world, right? That entrepreneurial economic world, that homo economics world that we think about. So I think it's important for us to think about the economy. There is a certain construct that's quite narrow. It's not necessarily about inputs. It's sometimes about outputs. It's sometimes about efficiency. But there's also this whole untold piece around distribution and care. And that last bit is really important. If you put care into it, that those two mountains I showed you before, those two mountains become much truer and much more possible for us to achieve because you know that it doesn't matter whether you come from a New Zealand Orthodox view or a Tūhoe worldview. We still want a world that's livable. We still want a society that's well functioning, but our pictures of what the successes are different. Right now, we're not even paying attention to those things. So, long answer again, but I think just be really wary of snake merchants coming to tell you these easy answers to these things. Degrowth is not a policy that's going to be sold with any degree of success because everybody wants to do things without cost. And degrowth is fundamentally about huge costs on current society, is you doing less, right? Consuming less, doing less, all of that kind of stuff. I think that's politically an almost impossible sell.
That's interesting. Thank you for those reflections. The Akina Foundation have just put out a social investment white paper. I'm going to put a link in the chat right now. Nicola was on this before. I think she's dropped off, but there are resources out there if people are interested in learning more. And one of the reasons that we know each other quite well is that we're on a board together about social housing or community housing called community finance. So you and I have had many discussions on this, like, what is it? What are we really trying to do here? And how do we have the maximum impact? I'm just curious about a practical side of things. Like if we identify that there's maybe less money for people, Joshua in the chat has said, what are sort of the immediate outcomes or the next steps from the person walking down the street point of view? Are they reducing their KiwiSaver contributions? Are they going on interest only for their mortgage? Are they not buying as many fruits and vegetables, which seems to be what was in that chart? What are the practical side of what this will mean?
Well, right now people are cutting back everything that they can cut back on. So it is cutting back on going not a huge amount in terms of mortgages, because by and large banks are saying you have to keep paying your mortgages, right? So they're not that generous. But we're seeing people cutting back on a lot of things, like on fruits and vegetables, but also on things like insurance. So I think a lot of people don't realize there's about a quarter of New Zealand houses that are not insured. Houses, right? And so that's extraordinary situation. We've never had that in New Zealand before. So people are cutting back on lots of different things. They're downgrading. So, going from the waddies to the pams, or not having the baked beans at all. So we're seeing quite a lot of pullback. But the big things that you can't avoid are things like rent, transport costs. So these are things that you just have to have to be able to go and do these kinds of things, right? To live your life, to go to get to work. So when I think about the current economic situation, what people are cutting back on is everything they can do relatively easily to be able to still get on, right? Unfortunately, I think this will have some pretty big impacts on people's health, people's mental health. One of the things that I see a lot when I'm dealing with people in the front line, so whether it's nurses, cops, fireys, what I'm hearing is just the level of anger and anxiety within the community is unprecedented. They have never experienced this, including people like supermarket workers. They're facing this significant anger within community, and I think that's what happens, right? When you're living in poverty, when you can't afford the things that you think give you dignity, people act out, right? People lash out. So there is a significant lashing out that's going on, and people are making big sacrifices. And there are no easy things to do. But what we're seeing, for example, I'm speaking at the hospitality conference end of this month. And people are cutting back on their coffees or eating out. Instead of going to the nice restaurant, they have it going to the cafe. So all these things are, people kind of preserve as much as possible. But the thing is, that that's not the life you had or the life that you aspire to. And people feel poorer, people feel hard done by. And that's that kind of the rawness that we're seeing in the community right now.
Mm. So I'm going to throw in a not really controversial, but let's see where it goes. Is the New Zealand government actually that in that bad a way? Financially, look at other governments, think about, OECD countries, look at our debt levels. Aren't we relatively low? Is it?
Absolutely. Look, the reality is that New Zealand's fiscal position is not relatively bad, but fundamentally, it is about the ideological position of what you think it should be relative to. And so I think when I think about New Zealand's fiscal position, it's not that we shouldn't be more careful. It's not that we shouldn't be repairing our books during good economic times. What I worry about is using austerity during a recession when it worsens the cycle. So if you look at New Zealand's history, by and large, we've had fairly responsible governments. So under both the national and Labour governments post the reforms of the 1980s, we had managed to get our books into order, right? We went from 100% of GDP debt down to about 20% of GDP debt. So we did extraordinary amount of sacrifice and discipline to get there. But every time we have a recession right now, we're getting more and more debt, right? And so that really worries me, is that the crises are coming more frequently and there is more and more demands of government. So we're not going to be able to keep doing this forever. We have to get our books back in order at some point in time and start preparing for the longer term stuff that's coming down the pipe, which is around demographics. So demographics and climate change are the two big ones that are facing us right in the face right now. So aging means that we're going to run out of taxpayers. So net, the people who pay the most taxes are people who are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. We're going to be running out of these people. And that means we're going to have a really hard time paying for all the things we have promised ourselves and we become used to. And climate change. What we have seen over the course of the last few big crises is every time there is a big whatever, flood, cyclone, earthquake, government should fix it. How many more crises do we have before the public of New Zealand say, no, you're on your own? So realistically, we're going to have to make some really big changes. And I think that's where those bigger issues are. So no, I don't think we're in a crisis situation in New Zealand at all in terms of our public finances, but we have some significant pressures and we should be getting our house in order when economic times are good.
It's interesting as well to think about who are we comparing ourselves to as well, right? Like if you're in a race, do you want to compare yourself to the slowest or the fastest? Like you want to be at the front. I'm just curious about some of those settings, because one of them that I've been reflecting on a lot, and what I'm about to say, is KiwiSaver. And by contrast to our cousins across the water in Australia, where next year the compulsory rate will reach 12%, we are at 3%. Is that, and therefore they literally have billions of dollars more put aside for their superannuation for the, getting older. Not only that, those super funds are now starting to invest into impact-driven type of endeavors. Any thoughts, comments on that particular point?
Yeah, a really good one. And I think I might answer that in three different parts because KiwiSaver kind of does a lot of different things. It's one about pensions, retirement savings. It's one about just savings in general. And it's about also investments. So when I think about pension savings, New Zealand is really underdone because we still assume that New Zealand super will be universal forever. It will not. We cannot afford New Zealand super to be universal forever. We simply cannot. And if that is not the case, we should be moving towards a private pension fund like Australia over time. So we can graduate our dependency on this over time. And the best way to do that is to have compulsory super that increases in contributions over time. That's what Australia did. They've actually been increasing over the course of 20 years, right? 30 years. And that's exactly what we should do. It should increase at 0.5% every year until we reach 10% plus. And we should do away with the subsidies because I don't think we should have subsidies for this. The subsidies that we do have should be targeted towards looking after women and getting children into savings products. So if we're going to put any money into it, it's really around the life stages, right? Women who go into maternity leave fall way behind in terms of their retirement savings. And we should really kind of top that up to make sure that that inequity is resolved as quickly as possible. But also we know that children are really underrepresented when it comes to savings in their life stages, heading into their independence in their later teens and early 20s. They start life with very little income. Singapore has some really great models in terms of how to save for children, for their education, for their first home, for their retirement. Really nice. We're not doing that yet. And the third part is really around the investment. Our KiwiSavers, I think from memory, less than 1% is invested in alternative assets, things like infrastructure, impact investment. In Europe, in the US, it's more like 17 to 20%. So imagine instead of having $1 billion invested in this stuff today, we instead had $20 billion invested in our infrastructure and community. And that's the potential of KiwiSaver in New Zealand. It is absolutely possible for us to do this, but we need to get some maturity around it. So all of these things are possible. I'm very optimistic that we're going to head down the direction where KiwiSaver will mature. But so far, we haven't seen any brave kind of steps to deal with KiwiSaver. KiwiSaver is actually really good in its design. It's just too modest. It just needs to grow up.
Yeah, I obviously totally agree with you. I think the retirement commissioner came out recently, maybe 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and said it should increase to 4%, which I obviously agree with. But hey, what if we had a strategy where like you say, over the next 15 years, we actually increased it to 12%, which is what Australia has. And I think there's examples as well, just to throw in, there are some KiwiSaver funds out there which are taking a new approach, a new lens on how they invest their money. And I'm thinking in particular of Simplicity, Pathfinder, Generate. Like there's some really good examples of some people thinking like, okay, we've got $1 billion here. How should we invest it for impact and financial return? So in the chat, I'm putting a little
You're just on mute.
Sorry, I was trying to hit send. So in the chat now, there's a link to our earlier conversation about impact investing, which is a video and a legal opinion that I'd done because my actual job is as a lawyer. And so this was questioning why do so many funds sit on their reserves and not use them for impact. So,
and it's also charities, right? It's also philanthropies. A lot of philanthropies will only give out the returns of their assets rather than working the assets themselves. The issues and the opportunities for change that we have in our country requires us to put our capital into it. It can't be just the returns on the top. So I think we're very aligned on this, Stephen, but I remember speaking at Philanthropy New Zealand conference many years ago, laying down the challenge. What are you going to do with your capital? It's lazy to put that money into a managed fund or invest it in other places. Put your money where your mouth is and actually make a difference, because that's how we make really big change. And I think it's coming. I think I see a movement happening within many philanthropies and KiwiSavers, but we need to do more. And policy should allow us to do that in a bigger way, like it is done in Australia, like it is done in Europe, and it is done in the US.
Yeah, definitely. We're drawing to the end of our time. We've had some comments. People are, they've got things to go to. Gemma said, best webinar I've joined in a long time. Thank you, which is awesome. I'd like to suggest maybe, Shama, we can do a follow-up in a couple months or something, because there's lots of questions we didn't get to. I knew that was going to happen. I just want to finish with one, which I thought was quite interesting. Up here, I think it was Josie was saying, are we paying too much attention to sentiment? Is our data sufficient to make more nuanced moves to challenge some of the economic inequalities? And kind of the reason I think that's important to ask is I do worry that we're seeing a growing difference between the haves and the have-nots, and that the wealthy have invested and they're doing just fine. Thank you very much. And it's really the poor, the people who need our help, it's getting worse for them. Yeah, can you just reflect on that question, but then any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, how you judge a society is how they look after their most poor and vulnerable, right? And the reason why you and I operate, do work in the impact space in community finance and social housing is because we see that's our way of being able to contribute to a solution to that. But at its very core, it goes back to that care that we talked about. I think when the welfare state was built and bigger government came across, the idea was that you don't need to have so much care because the government will do it for you. But I don't think the need for care in our community has gone away. In fact, I think the loss of the social connections and social cohesion is at the root of many of the issues that we're experiencing today. The reason why we have poverty that becomes ingrained and it does not dealt with is because we're not reaching out and lifting people out. So yes, there are lots of technical policy solutions, but I think at its very core is the idea of love. Do we have enough love for each other? Do we actually see other people? And I think it seems weird coming from economists, but I think that's the common thing that binds us in humanity, right? The reason why we get on is not because we have an intellectual connection, but because we have a human connection. I think that's the bit that you build off. So again, a complicated answer, but at its very core is love is about having no expectations for the goodwill that you give to others, right? And to me, that's the lens we need to take in the way that we operate in each of our little lenses, whatever that lens might be, or whatever that sphere might be. In each of the spheres, it cumulates to a greater good. And I think we have to rediscover that. I think it's coming. I think it's absolutely coming because I think we will need it because there is a desperate lack of it right now. And I don't think people like it.
Well, that's a great way to finish this conversation because I think love, ultimately, it's such a foundation. It sounds very ethereal when we talk about it, but it's actually so important. And my encouragement is for each of us. I know all of you are practitioners in various ways in what you do, but maybe go away feeling encouraged that let's bring that to as a lens to what each of you are doing, because I think it is so important. Otherwise, we don't want to just be about statistics and graphs. Ultimately, it's about us as a community, as people supporting and helping each other. So Shamubeel, you're so generous with your time. We really appreciate it. If any of those slides are available, I have a feeling people would love to see some of them. So maybe we can work out what we share as a follow-up. And there might be some questions that you and I can look at and see if we can answer separately. But I would love to do another. This is probably the fifth time that we've done this type of thing. And I really always enjoy it. So let's see if we can schedule it. If any of you have enjoyed this, if you are willing to share it and let people know about it, I think both Shamubeel and I, the reason we do this is we want to help effect change. And so that comes from each of you also being willing to tell other people about the content and hopefully get more thinking going in a generative and positive way. I know the both of us were very active on LinkedIn. I'm sure we're happy to connect with you on that platform and in other ways. I do another podcast called Seeds, and this will be episode 399 of that. So please check that out. I've talked with almost 400 people now on their life stories and journeys. And I do work as a lawyer helping people get legal structures right. So I've got lots of content on the legal structuring side of some of the things that we're talking about. So what we'll do is make this into a little video and a podcast episode, and then we'll be sharing it. And be watching out because I think there will be another follow-up at some point. And we'll try to continue these conversations. But my final thought is for each of you in what you're doing, go away encouraged that this many people showed up to talk about these types of issues. Sometimes you can feel like you're operating in a silo, like you're on your own, but that's not the case. Shamubeel is there. I'm there. Look at all of us here. I think we're all pushing in the same direction. So take encouragement from that back to what you're doing. Let's each do what we can within our environment using the tools that we have. So thanks everybody for joining. And Shamubeel, really appreciate your sharing as well.
Thank you, Steven.
Thank you, Shamubeel. You were awesome. It's Rachel here. Loved it. Steven, brilliant. Lovely to see you both. Have a fabulous afternoon. You've made my day.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bye.